Hi, so we're recording live from Brooklyn. We're doing our podcast, a Beloved Urban podcast, and this one is about our book, The Law and Identity Reader. I think the first question that we'll try to answer is, what is this book about? So maybe start with Helen, and we'll talk about the pictures that will be viewed tonight for the art showing.
From Jay.
Yeah.
All right, so yeah, this was a long project that Jason and I worked on, stemming from some of the things that we did in our classes together, in our political science classes at Kingsborough Community College. And we were really working to find how we can connect with the students, what are the ways that we can bring topics that are relevant to our students, make them connect with the content, and make them see themselves as active citizens. We really wanted to stress that political participation and democracy isn't something reserved for politicians or people with fancy degrees or big credentials, but something that we wanted them to understand was they had a stake in and that they should actively claim it.
So one of the pictures we used for the cover photo that we featured tonight was from which march? Could you talk about a little bit about how that kind of represents what Helen was saying about participation?
Sure. So that photo was from the Women's March in New York City. So it was the first Women's March in 2017. And I really wanted to capture all the energy that was there, because I know there were about 500,000 people in New York just there for that day, for that event. And there was just so much different energy and people that were around, and everybody really wanted to show and participate and be really active and say what they want to say. Like, that was their chance to really do it. So I wanted to show that in the photos.
One of the big features we were trying to talk about in the first part of the book is identity and its relationship to the law. I was doing a podcast earlier with Jasmine, who we actually cited as anti-labeling. And one thing that I pushed to try to understand about structural inequality came to the idea of, a lot of times when people think about their identity, they think about it as a fixed thing. And so we talked about how you can avoid stereotypes and avoid labeling, and also obviously avoiding stereotyping and labeling other people by kind of seeing your identity as something that can change depending on what circumstance you're in. And so we wanted to think a little bit about, how does participation push back as a form of resistance against labels and stereotypes? Since you mentioned the Women's March, there was a lot of women with very expressive signs, really advocating for their position. So we're trying to think of, how does this work towards agency? And I know, Helen, you've done research on agency, so I'm kind of just passing the torch from identity to agency. And how do we think about this as a form of resistance in this time?
Right. I think it's interesting, the fluidity of identity, and the situations you're in, the places you're in. That came out of one of the expressions from one of our students at Kingsborough. They said, when I am in the United States, I'm not, because my origins are Puerto Rican, I'm not American because my origins are Puerto Rican, but then when I go back to Puerto Rico, I'm not Puerto Rican, they see me as American. So they have to kind of adapt depending on where they are and the circumstances they're in. Same, could be said of the Women's March. Are you there as a mother? Are you there as an employee seeking equal rights and equal pay? So, your identity has different demands, I would say, in terms of the types of things that you're seeking, and that can influence the kind of agency that you'll advocate for, that you'll stress, that you'll seek. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think it's an important thing to be aware of those things, the many hats that you might hold, the many identities you might have, and I think that just shapes your agency and structures it in a different way, that you can have many different fights, many different struggles, many different things that you're seeking to rectify or advocate for.
I think one of the interesting things that we found through using the book in the classroom, and that was represented in the photos, was, I think when we think about fighting injustice and we use that language, we think about this huge clash or this huge confrontation. But I think two images that are going to be on display tomorrow night, one is just a wonderfully quintessential New York photo of 3 police officers leaning against a wall next to a coffee and donut shop. and how there was no confrontation, there was no, I mean, to my knowledge, there was no violence at that event. And then the overwhelming presence of children, right? And so it took an edge off of the concept of a confrontation when people were exercising agency. Do you want to talk a little bit about those pictures and what you're trying to capture?
Yeah, so we overheard during the Women's March that the police officers were speaking to each other that they were nervous that this was going to be, you know, some sort of catastrophic event, that there was going to be a lot of violence. But there turned out that it was completely fine and there was no violence. And it was just a lot of people really wanting to demonstrate, you know, their rights for human rights. So there are lots of children that I saw holding up really adorable signs, just, you know, because it is their future. They're going to grow up in this time. And, you know, they had really cute posters that, you know, they really understand now. And because this was such a huge event, and I'm sure they had a lot of impressions, you know, as they move forward in life. And just people of different cultures and generations, I think it was really important just to really show, for instance, one of the photos that I had, there's this older woman, she has a poster that says, 3 generations of feminists. And that just reminds me, like, this isn't just something that happened, like, you know, last year. This has been happening for many, many, many years, and people have been, like, pioneering this idea for everybody to be equal and to have human rights.
I think that's a good transition to the YouTube video that you shared in the agency section, Meet Ozma.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about how the generational aspect informed that the revolution in Egypt?
Sure. So you really made me think about how civic education is transferred, you know? Sometimes that's through formal education, and that can hit the mark or it could miss the mark. But also it's really instilled by your family. You know, what are the messages that your family are sharing with you in terms of civic participation? So my family comes from Egypt. Both my parents are Egyptian, born there, raised there, and I was the first generation born here. And when my parents came here, my dad always said, you never forfeit the right to vote, because that was something that didn't mean anything growing up in Egypt when your politicians would win with a 99% of the vote. So that was something that was ingrained in me even from a young age, that this is a right that is cherished and fought for and should be valued. So in Egypt, seeing that their quote-unquote democracy was far from, you know, something like, and even in Egypt, the protests in 2011 were also peaceful. They were very stressed that they would be peaceful, but the police again were at odds because they don't have, they're not used to people advocating or taking to the streets or protesting, so it put them on edge. They were concerned, so they were there with heavy militia and tanks and military and police guards and armed guards, but you just see, you know, men, women, old, young, Muslim, Christian, just there all for the common fight. And what was really wonderful about that is that in 18 days, they were able to successfully remove a politician who had been in power, the president who had been in power for over 30 years.
Wow.
So Asma is a young Muslim woman who took to YouTube, and if you're familiar with the Arab Spring, at some point Egypt had shut down the internet, which was an interesting thing to be done. You didn't know you could do that. But you know, it was reinstated by an anonymous hacker, internet guy, who was able to reboot the internet for the country, and Asma used her resources, and I think that's something that we stress in the book too. Again, no fancy skills, no fancy credentials. She had a computer, she had a webcam, she had a voice.
Yes.
So she went and she put a call out, and she basically said, I'm gonna be there, and if you're not gonna be there, then you're a coward, you're a traitor, you're scared, you're weak, but I'm gonna be there. And because of that, everyone else kind of said, they kind of shed their fear. And prior to that, it was guaranteed that if you protested anything, your life was in danger. But when you knew that you were going to be joined by thousands, millions other people, your fear didn't seem so significant anymore. You felt protected by this solidarity that solidarity that you had with others. So ASMA's rallying cry was successful in getting people out there on January 25th to kind of to Tahrir Square, the main square in Cairo. And you can see the images. It's just remarkable, you know, just to see people there camped out, sacrificing their income. You know, they didn't go to work. They were just so committed, so dedicated to that cry. And you know, they also had beautiful images of Christians creating like a human barrier blocking the police so that at prayer time the Muslims could pray without feeling that they were vulnerable to any attacks. So just, you know, grassroots. This wasn't something that was premeditated. This wasn't something that took years of planning. It was just something that was really grassroots and spontaneous and effective. And I think that's something that we want to stress to our students, that this isn't something that should be insurmountable or monumental. It could just be something small that really can be effective and make a difference.
So I think the next thing we'd want to talk about in the book kind of goes in a sequence of identity, agency, and advocacy. We had two parts within agency, one that kind of connects back to identity, and then the second part that connects towards advocacy. I know that when we were putting together the book, we made it our intent to try to find a very large, diverse set of sources that span poetry, philosophy, social science, etc. But I guess I didn't quite realize until we were teaching that second part is pretty dedicated to feminism. And what ended up being the kind of takeaway from that was that the transition from identity to advocacy via agency happened in dialogue with other people. So there was the section on Patricia Hill Collins that talked about the power of self-definition, and that was in dialogue with other people.
Right.
There was the reading about Justice Ginsburg's clerks, and I thought that was really interesting because she's carrying on a dialogue with her clerks, you know, literally, but then also through the writing, she's expanding that to a lot more people. So I kind of took the lead here in defining what I think advocacy means, and so I saw it as this kind of confrontation between identity and agency, and that with dialogue you can get to the point of advocacy. And I think the reason I'm saying that is because if you recall, we started this journey together, right? We've been on our own independent journeys back in 2012, and then we started in 2013. That was before the big election and before the time of resistance, as people are kind of talking about. So I think of this idea of being an advocate as something that you kind of need to be cool, calm, and collected and do over a long period of time. That it's not something that, although it's good to start out at a march or it's good to start out from a place of personal identity, at some point, right, it needs to graduate into this larger movement with other people. And I can't see that really happening in any other way besides dialogue. So I guess I'd turn it to either of you at this point of what does advocacy mean to you? Tomorrow's going to be a celebration of advocacy.
Right.
So
I think advocacy means, like, you know yourself well enough and you know the situations around you well enough where you feel empowered to take action against something that's not right. And it's either for you or for somebody else who's unable to advocate for themselves, and you just kind of like own it and just be like, you know, this is what I stand for, and because it is your life, you know, you can't avoid these things. So you have one life, so just, you know, own it.
Yeah, and I think the solidarity and the strength that you get from knowing, so dialogue helps you see that, oh, okay, I'm not the only one that thinks about this is right or wrong, or I'm not the only one that has this concern. And then you also see that the other people that share these same concerns don't necessarily look like you or have the same experiences as you. So then it kind of broadens that base that says, okay, I'm not in this alone. So that solidarity through the dialogue, I think, gives a lot of courage for, you know, because sometimes, you know, you say, oh, well, I know I'm going to keep fighting, I'm going to own this, but oh my goodness, if I'm all by myself, how am I going to do this? But then you're kind of like, oh, I've got you, and you,
Right,
and you, and all your friends.
People who who think the same things.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think that that's a huge, huge help in terms of stamina, in terms of, you know, calm, cool, and collected, that you need to have this persistence, but it could be exhausting, it could be stressful and taxing and emotional, but then you know you're not in it alone. You have other people that could continue the fight, pick up the fight, or it's not something that if you don't achieve this in your lifetime, it's a failure or a waste, because you're comforted knowing that you have other people who are going to keep the fight for you, or continue to advocate and agitate for this.
So maybe the final thing that we can talk about is this goal of keeping that dialogue going. And so maybe I'll highlight, in the last section we have a series of modern problems, whether it be technology, feminism, trying to remember all of them. I think there's workplace, issues in the workplace, back to the racism is also in there again. So I think maybe we could think about what is a modern issue, and again I'll start. I think one of the readings we have in there is Remix, which is a short reading from a longer book, and it's also a documentary about how technology can be used in a way that furthers the interests of this generation. So kind of like using the internet, and really digital technology, so not really just the internet, but maybe using the internet as a place where we can share digital technology to spread our message, I guess in the same way that Ozma really did. And so I think about what we're doing here, right? We're using this digital technology. It's pretty, right? It's high tech, right? But at the end of the day, what do? We're sitting around and talking. So this is one way of building community, I think, and so that's the message I'd like to leave for people tomorrow, is that even if you're afraid of technology or don't know how to use every piece, that it's pretty basic once one person knows how to set it up, and just keeping the conversation going is something that I think is really important. To redefine both what technology means is something that's useful for us in this fight against injustice, and then also as redefining what we think about community, and really trying to build communities like we're doing, and I think we have done. And we're inviting more people tomorrow, so please, join in with us. And so I guess, you'll just think about it in that way. What message would you like to have based on this idea of advocacy and maybe on a modern problem? Which I realize is a big question. But that's why it's the last one.
There are plenty, but I think again, keeping with where our conversation has been going, the technology and the digital part, again, broadens our base.
Yeah.
So again, it's beyond borders, the types of challenges. We might not have ever known about Asma had she not posted on YouTube, or we might not have known as much about the Arab Spring if it hadn't been so heavily pushed and driven by social media. So again, that adds to whatever fight you're fighting for. The technology can help you move beyond and say, this isn't just an American thing, or this isn't just confined to here, or even a developed country thing. We can kind of see what's happening in other parts of the world and use our technical advantages and kind of leverage them, and then it's kind of symbiotic. What can others help us do, and what can we do, so we can share the gifts and share our wealth to fight for the same fight. In terms of an issue, that I'm strongly concerned about the proliferation of guns in our country, and the amount of shootings, and it is a national emergency when